11 Stoic Lessons for Deep Self-Respect. Rewire your mind. Every morning. Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism. Most people do not lose their self-respect in one dramatic moment. They lose it quietly, early, and repeatedly. They lose it in the first thoughts they allow when they wake up. Before the body has even fully risen, the mind is already kneeling. It kneels before anxiety, before memory, before regret, before the opinions of people who are not even in the room. And that is how an entire life becomes weakened, not by one catastrophe, but by 1,000 mornings of inner surrender. Marcus Aurelius understood something that most people still refuse to face. Your first battle of the day is never with the world. It is with the mind that interprets the world. Before you face disrespect, pressure, temptation, comparison, rejection, or disappointment, you face your own thoughts. You face the voice that tells you that you are behind, that you are not enough, that your worth is unstable, that your peace depends on how others respond to you. If that voice rules you in the morning, it will rule you all day. Then your mood will belong to circumstances, your direction will belong to external noise, and your dignity will become something fragile, always exposed, always negotiable. That is why deep self-respect is not built in public. It is built in silence, in the invisible moments when no one is watching and no one is praising you. It is built when you choose not to begin the day as a servant to emotion. It is built when you remember that your value does not rise because someone admires you, and it does not collapse because someone ignores you. It is built when you stop measuring yourself through reaction and start governing yourself through principle. Most people want confidence. The Stoics wanted something greater. They wanted inner authority. Confidence can disappear when life humiliates you. Confidence can weaken when the body is tired, when plans fail, when others pull away, when success takes longer than expected. But self-respect, true self-respect, is deeper than confidence. It is the refusal to betray your own conscience. It is the discipline of standing by what is right, even when no reward comes quickly. It is the calm knowledge that your character matters more than your image. It is the decision to live in such a way that you no longer have to beg yourself for approval. Look carefully at the suffering of many people today, and you will notice the same hidden wound beneath different faces. One person calls it insecurity, another calls it overthinking, another calls it emotional exhaustion, another says they feel lost, disrespected, ignored, or empty. But often the deeper issue is this: they have lost the habit of honoring themselves. They have allowed their inner world to become disordered. They wake up and immediately enter comparison. They replay what someone said. They relive what hurt them. They seek signs that they matter. They hand their emotional state to text messages, to attention, to silence, to praise, to rejection. Then they wonder why they feel unstable. But how could a person feel strong when the gates of the mind are left open every morning? Stoicism offers a harsher truth, but also a liberating one. No one can give you the self-respect that comes from self-command. No one can install dignity into a mind that keeps abandoning itself. No one can think for you, discipline you for you, or protect you from the consequences of your own inner negligence. This is not bad news. This is power. Because the moment you understand that self-respect is built by how you think, what you tolerate, what you repeat, and what you refuse, your life stops being a theater of emotional accidents and starts becoming a field of deliberate practice. And this practice begins in the morning. Not because mornings are magical, but because mornings reveal who is in charge. When the day begins, your mind is impressionable. It is deciding what deserves attention, what deserves fear, what deserves energy, and what deserves belief. If you fail there, the rest of the day becomes recovery. You spend your hours trying to repair a direction that was already broken at sunrise. But if you take command there, if you begin with clarity, restraint, and inner order, the entire tone of your life starts to change. You stop chasing emotional relief and start building moral strength. You stop asking whether people value you and start asking whether your conduct is worthy of respect. You stop living as a reaction and start living as a standard. That is what this video is about. Not shallow motivation, not borrowed confidence, not pretending to be strong while remaining inwardly dependent. This is about training the mind to return to itself every morning. This is about reclaiming your center before the world tests it. This is about learning, through Stoic lessons rooted in the spirit of Marcus Aurelius, how to think in a way that protects your dignity, sharpens your judgment, and makes your peace less vulnerable to chaos. Because the greatest theft in your life is not always what others take from you. Sometimes it is what you keep surrendering without noticing: your attention, your discipline, your peace, your standards, your respect for your own soul. And if that theft is happening every morning, then every morning is also your chance to stop it. Do not let the day begin in reaction. That is where self-respect is first wounded. Not when someone insults you, not when life frustrates you, not when the world refuses to reward your effort. It begins earlier than that. It begins in the first private surrender of the morning, when your mind wakes up and immediately starts bowing to noise that has not even touched you yet. A message not answered, a memory that still burns, a fear about the future, a face you cannot stop thinking about, a comparison you did not ask for, but allowed anyway. Before your feet touch the ground, your peace is already gone. Before the day has even revealed its terms, you have already accepted defeat in your imagination. This is one of the most silent forms of self-disrespect because it feels normal. Most people have lived this way for so long that they no longer notice the damage. They think it is natural to wake up tense, scattered, emotionally invaded. They think it is natural to check the world before checking themselves. They think it is natural to begin the day by seeing who texted, who watched, who liked, who ignored, who advanced, who seems happier, stronger, more desired, more accomplished. But what they call normal is often just a repeated abandonment of inner authority. It is the habit of allowing external possibilities to enter the mind before reason has taken its seat. Marcus Aurelius did not teach a life of passivity. He taught a life of command, and command always begins within. A man cannot claim to respect himself if his first mental movement every morning is submission, if his state depends on what might happen, what someone else might think, or what memory chooses to replay. Then he is not entering the day as a ruler of his inner world. He is entering it as a captive waiting for instructions from chance. That is not strength. That is psychological dependency, wearing the mask of routine. Think about how much of your life has been shaped by mornings you never challenged. Mornings when you woke up and instantly returned to the same emotional script, the same old wound, the same self-doubt, the same internal hunger for proof that you matter. The same restless need to know whether the outside world is going to validate your existence today. And if that validation did not arrive, your energy changed, your voice changed, your posture changed, your discipline weakened, your focus fractured. Then one small reaction became a chain. One thought became a mood. One mood became a behavior. One behavior became another day you could not fully respect. This is why the Stoics were so serious about mental discipline. They understood that the mind is not harmed only by major tragedies. It is harmed by permission. Permission given to useless fear. Permission given to fantasy. Permission given to emotional rehearsal. Permission given to internal chaos disguised as sensitivity. The person who reacts too early loses twice, first to imagination, then to reality. By the time the real challenge arrives, they are already tired from fighting things that never even happened. Deep self-respect requires another posture. It requires that when the morning begins, you do not immediately open the gates to whatever is loudest. You return first to what is yours, your judgment, your breath, your conduct, your duty, your standards. Before the world enters, you must establish who is in charge, not with dramatic rituals, not with artificial motivation, with sober remembrance. I will not begin this day as a servant to impulse. I will not let memory set my direction. I will not let uncertainty write my emotional script. I will not hand over my mind before I have even spoken to my own reason. This is not coldness, it is loyalty to yourself. Many people think self-respect is something expressed later, in boundaries, in silence, in how you respond to mistreatment. But its earliest form is this: refusing to let your interior life be hijacked at dawn, refusing to wake up and instantly become a mirror of whatever fear is nearest, refusing to let attention become a kind of worship. Because whatever captures your attention first begins to shape your identity for the rest of the day. If that first capture is anxiety, you live defensively. If it is comparison, you live inadequately. If it is emotional hunger, you live dependently. But if it is reason, then something changes. You begin from center, not from lack. And that center does not make you rigid. It makes you clear. The difference matters. A clear person can still feel pain, disappointment, uncertainty, and pressure. But they do not let those things occupy the throne before the day has begun. They feel without kneeling. They observe without obeying. They notice the disturbance without turning it into identity. That is where self-respect starts becoming visible. Not in grand speeches, but in quiet refusals. I will not start the day already conquered. I will not begin by surrendering to what has not earned power over me. Once you understand this, mornings stop being casual. They become decisive. The first battle is no longer invisible to you. You see it for what it is, a contest between reaction and authority, between old conditioning and deliberate thought, between being pulled and standing firm. Most people lose that battle so early and so often that they build an entire personality around recovering from it. But the Stoic chooses something else. He does not wait until noon to become himself. He begins the day by returning to his own command. And yet that is not the deepest form of self-disrespect. There is something even more dangerous than reacting too early. It is the habit of asking your emotions for permission to live with strength. Most people do not follow reason in the morning. They follow mood. And because of that, their entire life becomes unstable. They wake up and immediately begin negotiating with emotion, as if emotion were a ruler, a judge, a source of truth. If they feel motivated, they move. If they feel inspired, they act. If they feel calm, they are kind to themselves. But if they feel tired, heavy, hurt, uncertain, or discouraged, everything changes. Their standards become flexible. Their discipline becomes optional. Their clarity becomes clouded. Then they call this being human, when in fact it is often just being governed by whatever state happened to arrive first. This is one of the most destructive habits a person can build because it appears harmless. No one sees it as a betrayal. It looks soft, it sounds understandable. It hides behind phrases people repeat every day without questioning them. I do not feel like it today. I am not in the right headspace. Maybe tomorrow I will have more energy. Maybe later I will be ready. But a life built on this logic becomes a prison of delay. You stop living by what is right and start living by what is comfortable. You stop doing what preserves your dignity and start doing what protects your temporary emotional state. This may feel compassionate in the moment, but repeated enough, it becomes self-abandonment. The Stoics were never at war with emotion itself. They were at war with enslavement to it. They understood that feelings arise, but they refused to treat them as commands. Epictetus taught that what disturbs people is not events themselves, but the judgments they form about them. That means the problem is not that you wake up feeling resistance. The problem is that you immediately agree with that resistance. You let it define the day. You let it decide what kind of person you will be. You let a passing inner climate speak with the authority that belongs to reason. And once that happens, the rest is predictable. You become easier to weaken, easier to distract, easier to break. Look closely at how many people lose respect for themselves. It is rarely because they do not know what they should do. They know. They know they should get up. They know they should stop checking the thing that keeps hurting them. They know they should return to their work, their training, their duty, their word, their standard. But what stops them is not ignorance. It is permission granted to feeling. Feeling says not now. Feeling says too much. Feeling says maybe later. Feeling says protect yourself from discomfort. And because they have trained themselves to obey mood, they keep postponing the very actions that would restore their strength. This is where deep self-respect separates itself from ordinary self-image. A person with fragile self-image wants to feel powerful. A person with deep self-respect is willing to act with principle even while feeling weak. That is a completely different kind of strength. It means your conduct is no longer waiting for emotional approval. It means you stop asking your inner turbulence whether you're allowed to live clearly today. You understand that mood is weather, not law. It changes, it moves, it exaggerates, it passes. But if you build your choices on it, your identity begins to shift with every internal storm. Marcus Aurelius knew what it meant to rise without emotional enthusiasm. He did not write to himself as a man overflowing with ease. He wrote as someone who understood resistance and still chose duty. That is what makes Stoicism powerful. It does not require you to feel ideal before acting well. It requires you to remember what kind of being you are and to live accordingly. The morning is where this becomes visible. When you wake up and feel heaviness, that is not the end of the decision. It is the beginning of it. At that moment, the question is not, how do I get rid of this feeling first? The real question is, why have I given this feeling so much authority over my conduct? There is a hidden humiliation in living by mood. Not because emotions make you weak, but because surrendering your agency to them makes you inconsistent. You become someone you cannot rely on. One day you are focused, the next day you disappear into hesitation. One day you speak with conviction, the next day you doubt everything. One day you pursue what matters, the next day you let one emotional wave erase your direction. Over time, this inconsistency damages the relationship you have with yourself. You stop trusting your own word. You stop believing your own intentions. You promise, delay, promise again, then delay again. Eventually, the deepest wound is not failure itself. It is the quiet knowledge that you keep abandoning your own command. The Stoic answer is not emotional suppression, it is emotional dethronement. Let the feeling exist, but do not let it rule. Let resistance speak, but do not let it decide. Let discomfort arrive, but do not build your day around avoiding it. You can feel sadness and still act with dignity. You can feel fatigue and still remain faithful to your standards. You can feel uncertainty and still move with order. That is what rewires the mind, not waiting for a perfect state, but proving to yourself repeatedly that your highest self is not hostage to your lowest moods. The more you practice this, the more something powerful begins to happen. You stop fearing your own emotional fluctuations. You stop treating them like emergencies. You stop waking up and thinking that the first feeling of the day has prophetic meaning. Instead, you begin to observe it with discipline. This is here. It is real, but it is not my master. That sentence alone can save years of wasted life. Because most people do not need more information. They need liberation from the habit of consulting emotion before consulting reason. And once you stop asking your mood for permission, another enemy reveals itself, one that invades even faster, more quietly, and more brutally than emotion. It is the habit of measuring your worth against the lives of others the moment the day begins. Comparison is one of the fastest ways to destroy self-respect because it makes you abandon your own life before the day has even begun. You wake up, and instead of entering the morning as yourself, you immediately begin measuring. Someone is ahead, someone looks stronger, someone seems more loved, more admired, more disciplined, more successful, more desired, more certain. In a few seconds, your attention leaves your own path and becomes trapped in a silent courtroom where your worth is being judged against images, fragments, appearances, and half-truths. By the time you finish that inner trial, your peace is already weakened and your posture toward life has already changed. This is one of the most dangerous habits of the modern mind because it does not look violent. There is no visible wound, no public humiliation, no dramatic collapse. It is quiet, internal, repetitive, but its effect is devastating. Comparison teaches you to start the day from deficiency. It teaches you to interpret another person's visible moment as evidence of your invisible failure. It pulls you away from reality and locks you into distortion. Because when you compare, you are almost never comparing truth to truth. You are comparing your private struggles to someone else's public surface. You are comparing your doubts to their display, your unfinished work to their polished image, your behind-the-scenes burden to their chosen presentation. No mind can remain stable under that kind of unfair measurement. The Stoics would have recognized this as a form of slavery. Not because success, beauty, status, or admiration are evil in themselves, but because the moment your mind begins using external appearances as the standard for your own value, you have handed away your freedom. You are no longer rooted in reason. You are no longer asking what is in your control. You are no longer concerned first with character, judgment, discipline, or conduct. You are looking outward for a mirror that will tell you whether you are enough. And the world is a cruel mirror when used that way. It reflects noise. It rewards spectacle. It amplifies illusion. It tempts you to betray your own nature in order to keep up with people whose inner life you do not even know. This is why comparison feels so exhausting. It does not simply make you jealous, it makes you divided. One part of you knows that your path requires patience, effort, silence, and repetition. Another part keeps looking sideways, asking whether you are late, whether you missed your moment, whether others are becoming what you should have become by now. That division drains energy before the day has a chance to become meaningful. Instead of acting with concentration, you act with agitation. Instead of building, you react. Instead of honoring your own process, you contaminate it with urgency borrowed from someone else's timeline. And the deeper danger is this. Comparison does not only make you feel inferior when others seem ahead, it also makes your self-worth unstable even when you appear ahead. Because if your value depends on being above someone, then peace becomes impossible. There will always be someone rising faster, glowing brighter, achieving more, receiving more attention. So the mind that lives by comparison never reaches rest. It swings between envy and arrogance, insecurity and superiority, hunger and fear. It's always being moved by the position of others, never grounded in the integrity of its own direction. That is not ambition. That is dependence wearing the clothes of ambition. Marcus Aurelius constantly returned to the idea that a person must do what belongs to their own nature and station, not what flatters the crowd, not what imitates another life, not what gains admiration at the price of inner disorder. Your task is not to become a copy that competes better. Your task is to become whole in your own role. This is the part people resist because it sounds simple, but it demands maturity. It means there are things you must stop feeding. Stop feeding the urge to check who is advancing. Stop feeding the desire to interpret someone else's brightness as your darkness. Stop feeding the addiction to external measures that make you forget the work still waiting in your own hands. Deep self-respect grows when you can see another person's progress without using it as a weapon against yourself. That requires discipline. It requires a mind trained to return. Return to your labor. Return to your principles. Return to what can actually be improved today. Return to the truth that another person's path is not proof of your failure. It is simply their path. The moment you stop forcing everything into a personal verdict, something inside you becomes lighter. You are no longer waking up to compete with ghosts. You are waking up to meet your own responsibilities with clarity. There is also a subtle humiliation in comparison that many people never name. It makes you unavailable to your own life. You can be in the middle of building something real, something meaningful, something slow and necessary, and still feel poor because your attention has been stolen by someone else's pace. You can be making quiet progress and still feel stagnant because your mind has been trained to respect spectacle more than substance. Then you start neglecting what is truly yours. Your discipline weakens, your gratitude fades, your standards become confused, not because your life has lost value, but because your gaze has lost loyalty. The Stoic correction is severe, but freeing. Another person's fortune is not your measure. Another person's recognition is not your command. Another person's image is not your duty. Your concern is this: what are you doing with your own mind, your own actions, your own character, your own hours? That is where dignity lives, not in being ahead of others, but in refusing to be pulled away from yourself by appearances. The more deeply you understand this, the less power the world has to unsettle you before breakfast. You stop waking up to compare and start waking up to build. And yet comparison is still not the quietest way people betray themselves in the morning. There is something even more destructive because it looks so small that most people excuse it. It is the first tiny compromise of the day, the one that seems harmless, but slowly teaches the soul that its own standards do not matter. Self-respect is rarely destroyed by one grand act of failure. It is usually weakened by small permissions, tiny compromises. Quiet acts of self-betrayal that seem too insignificant to matter in the moment, yet powerful enough to shape who you become. This is why the first compromise of the day matters so much. Not because it ruins everything instantly, but because it sets a tone. It teaches the mind what kind of authority your own standards really have. And if the answer is not much, then the rest of the day begins to decay from within. Most people imagine betrayal as something dramatic, a broken promise, a major lie, a visible collapse. But the betrayal that damages self-respect most deeply is often almost invisible. It happens when you wake up and do the thing you already knew you should not do. You check what unsettles you. You delay what matters. You indulge what weakens you. You speak inwardly in a tone you would never use towards someone you truly respected. You let distraction enter before purpose. You let craving enter before reason. You let avoidance dress itself up as rest. None of these things seems fatal on its own. That is exactly why they are dangerous. They pass unnoticed while quietly teaching the soul a devastating lesson. Your word to yourself does not carry much weight. This is the part many people resist because it forces them to stop blaming emotion, circumstances, and pressure for everything. Sometimes the problem is not that life is hard. The problem is that you keep making peace with what is beneath you. You know what preserves your mind, yet you keep choosing what fragments it. You know what strengthens your discipline, yet you repeatedly entertain what erodes it. You know what brings order, yet you keep opening the door to disorder and then acting surprised when your inner world feels unstable. The Stoics would not have called this bad luck. They would have called it a failure of self-governance. There is something humiliating about repeatedly abandoning what you know is right. Not because it makes you unworthy as a human being, but because it divides you against yourself. One part of you still sees clearly. It still knows the better path. It still recognizes the standard, the duty, the wiser action. But another part keeps choosing against that knowledge in small, repeated ways. Over time, this creates inner fracture. You begin to lose faith in your own seriousness. You hear your own intentions and do not believe them. You make plans, but there is no authority behind them. You set standards, but they feel decorative. And the deepest wound is not that you failed once. It is that you taught yourself your own conscience can be ignored without consequence. This is why the first compromise of the morning is never just about the act itself. It is symbolic. It is educational. It tells the mind who is in charge. If the day begins with indulgence, avoidance, delay, or weakness disguised as harmless comfort, then your deeper self receives the message immediately. We do not stand firm here. We negotiate with what we know. We bend early. We postpone discipline. We trade clarity for ease. Once that lesson is repeated enough times, self-respect begins to erode, not in theory, but in felt reality. You can sense it. You may still speak confidently. You may still look composed. But underneath, there is a quiet disappointment in yourself that no public image can fix. Marcus Aurelius understood that character is not built by large performances. It is shaped by repeated alignment, by doing what is right because it is right, especially when there is no audience and no immediate reward. That is why the smallest morning choice has such power. It is often your first opportunity to prove whether your principles are alive or merely admired. Anyone can praise discipline in theory. Anyone can admire virtue from a distance, but the real test comes when the day is still young and no one is there to force your hand. What do you choose then? That answer tells the truth. Deep self-respect requires that you become more alert to these first betrayals, not paranoid, not harsh in a theatrical way, honest. Honest enough to notice when you are about to make a small choice that teaches your mind to distrust you. Honest enough to say, this is not trivial, this is training. Every repeated action either strengthens my authority over myself or weakens it. Every permission I grant either aligns me with what I claim to value or pushes me further into self-division. Once you begin seeing life through this lens, you stop dismissing your little compromises as harmless. You see that they are not random at all. They are votes. Votes for the kind of self you are becoming. And this is where many people begin to recover their dignity, not by waiting for a major transformation, but by refusing the first inner betrayal when the day begins, by cutting off the impulse before it becomes routine, by choosing one act of alignment before the world starts pulling. It may seem small from the outside, no one applauds it, no one even notices, but inside something changes. You start rebuilding trust with yourself. You begin proving that your standards are not merely emotional preferences. They are commands you are willing to honor. That changes posture. That changes thought. That changes the entire relationship you have with your own mind. The person with deep self-respect is not perfect. They still feel resistance. They still get tempted. They still know what it is to struggle, but they become less willing to cooperate with what diminishes them. They stop acting as though every impulse deserves a seat at the table. They stop excusing small betrayals just because they are common. They understand that what is common is often exactly what is corroding people. So they choose differently, quietly, early, repeatedly. And over time, these invisible refusals give them something the world cannot hand out, inner solidity. But seeing the first betrayal is only the beginning. The deeper transformation happens when you stop waking up for comfort and start rising for function. Because self-respect is not only protected by what you refuse, it is also built by what you rise to do. Most people wake up asking the wrong question. They ask how they feel. They ask whether they are in the mood. They ask whether they have enough energy, enough desire, enough emotional readiness to face the day. And because they begin there, they remain trapped there. Their mornings become a negotiation with comfort. Their actions wait for emotional permission. Their purpose becomes secondary to their state. Then they wonder why they feel weak, inconsistent, easily discouraged. But a life cannot become stable when it is built on the shifting ground of feeling. At some point, a person must stop rising for comfort and start rising for function. This is one of the most important corrections a Stoic can make. You are not here merely to protect your mood. You are here to fulfill your nature. Marcus Aurelius returns to this with striking force when he reminds himself that he rises to do the work of a human being. That is a severe idea in the best sense. It cuts through excuses. It strips away the illusion that the day begins with your preferences. It reminds you that you have a role to play, a mind to govern, duties to meet, character to preserve, work to do. Whether your emotions cooperate immediately is not the highest question. The higher question is this: what is required of me now if I intend to live with dignity? That shift changes everything. The moment you stop treating your morning like a search for ideal feeling, you recover authority over your life. You are no longer waiting to be carried by motivation. You are no longer measuring your seriousness by your enthusiasm. You begin to see that much of what made you unstable was not hardship itself, but the belief that you were supposed to act only when acting felt smooth. That belief weakens people more than difficulty ever could. It teaches them to delay their own formation. It teaches them to worship readiness instead of responsibility. It teaches them to think that discipline begins after resistance disappears, when in truth, discipline begins the moment you move, despite it. This does not mean becoming mechanical or inhuman. It means remembering what gives a human life structure. Function is not a cold word here. It is a noble one. It means that your existence is not meant to drift aimlessly between impulses. It means your mind is meant to judge well, your will is meant to choose well, your actions are meant to reflect reason rather than appetite. To rise for function means to wake up and return to your proper work, even if your emotions arrive late. It means that your first loyalty is not to comfort, but to alignment, not to ease, but to order, not to indulgence, but to the part of you that knows what must be done. Many people lose respect for themselves because they have made peace with a life of postponement. They wait to feel better before becoming serious. They wait to feel inspired before returning to what matters. They wait to feel clear before acting with clarity. But the longer a person waits for internal perfection before beginning, the more fragile they become. Action starts to feel enormous. Duty starts to feel oppressive. Even simple tasks begin to look heavy because the soul has been trained to resist friction. That is why so many people wake up already burdened by the day. It is not always because the day is too hard. Sometimes it is because they have forgotten how to meet life without asking comfort to approve it first. The Stoic response is direct. Get up for what you are here to do. Return to your function before your imagination has time to weaken you. Stand up before indulgence starts speaking in the language of self-care. Move before hesitation invents another philosophical excuse to stay where you are. There is power in acting before the lower part of the mind has finished building its case. Because every time you rise for function, you prove something essential to yourself. You prove that your life is not governed by passing weather. You prove that your standards can survive discomfort. You prove that your deeper self is still capable of command. This is where deep self-respect becomes tangible. It is not abstract anymore. It is not a nice idea you admire in books. It becomes physical, behavioral, embodied. You rise when you could stay down. You return to your work when avoidance offers softer alternatives. You do what preserves your order even when no one is there to witness it. That builds a kind of pride that is clean, not arrogant, a quiet esteem rooted in evidence. Not because you told yourself you are strong, but because you acted in a way that made strength believable. The soul begins to trust what the body has repeatedly obeyed. And there is another hidden gift in rising for function. It reduces self-obsession. The person who wakes up asking only how they feel becomes trapped in themselves. Every sensation becomes important. Every fluctuation becomes significant. Every emotional shade demands interpretation. But the person who wakes up asking what must be done is freed from much of that noise. Their attention turns outward in the right way, toward action, contribution, discipline, usefulness, responsibility. They stop circling endlessly around their own state and start inhabiting a life with structure. That alone can heal a great deal of inner chaos. This is why mornings matter so much. They are the training ground where your relationship to duty becomes visible. If you begin the day trying to be comfortable, the rest of the day will keep testing how much discomfort you can avoid. But if you begin the day by returning to function, something steadier emerges. You remember that your life has shape, that you are not here merely to chase pleasant states. That dignity is often built in the minutes when you choose what is necessary over what is soothing. And yet, even this is not enough if the mind keeps trying to control what never belonged to it in the first place. Because after a person learns to rise for function, the next lesson is harder and even more freeing. They must learn to separate what is theirs from what never was. One of the deepest reasons people lose self-respect is that they keep trying to govern what was never theirs to govern. They wake up and immediately begin carrying things that do not belong in their hands. The opinions of others, the timing of life, the outcome of conversations, the return of affection, the recognition they hope to receive, the behavior of people who have not even learned to govern themselves. Then, because these things refuse to obey, the mind becomes agitated. It tightens. It obsesses. It rehearses, it pleads inwardly, and little by little, dignity is replaced by dependence because the person has made their peace conditional on forces that were never under their command. This is where Stoicism becomes brutally liberating. Epictetus built an entire doorway into freedom through one severe distinction. Some things are up to you, and some are not. That sounds simple until you realize how rarely people actually live by it. Most do not. Most wake up and immediately confuse desire with authority. They want something, so they begin acting as though they should be able to control it. They want someone to understand them, so they suffer when they cannot force understanding. They want certainty, so they become unstable in the face of unpredictability. They want approval, so they keep bending their posture around the moods and reactions of other people. What begins as emotional attachment becomes internal servitude. Not because they care, but because they have forgotten the border between influence and ownership. This confusion is exhausting because it makes the mind do work that can never be completed. You cannot finish controlling another person's judgment. You cannot finally secure the future. You cannot remove all ambiguity from human relationships. You cannot guarantee reward, loyalty, fairness, timing, or applause. Yet millions of people wake up every day trying to perform exactly this impossible labor. No wonder they feel depleted before the day has even unfolded. They are spending their first energy on battles that have no ending because they were never theirs to win. And the damage goes beyond anxiety. It cuts directly into self-respect, because every time you keep trying to master what is not yours, you abandon what is. Your judgment becomes neglected. Your character becomes secondary. Your speech becomes less honest. Your conduct becomes reactive. Your discipline weakens. Your inner life starts orbiting around external uncertainty. You stop asking the Stoic question, which is, what kind of person am I being in this moment, and start asking the desperate question, which is how do I make the outside world obey my emotional needs. That shift is devastating. It turns a human being with the capacity for inner sovereignty into someone constantly bargaining with reality. Marcus Aurelius understood this at the highest level possible. He ruled an empire, yet his private writings constantly returned to restraint. Not control over everything, but control over himself. That is the paradox people miss. The more mature a person becomes, the less they waste themselves on trying to dominate what lies outside their proper reach. They become more exact, not more frantic, more inwardly ordered, not more invasive. They stop scattering their mind across 10,000 things they cannot command and begin gathering it around the few things they actually can: thought, choice, action, interpretation, principle. That is where deep self-respect begins to harden into something real, not when life becomes easy, but when your mind stops treating the uncontrollable as if it were your moral responsibility. Imagine how much quiet humiliation disappears the moment you stop trying to force outcomes that are not yours. The humiliation of over-explaining yourself to be understood. The humiliation of mentally chasing what has already withdrawn. The humiliation of rearranging your piece around whether others respond the way you hoped. The humiliation is not in caring, it is in forgetting your place, in trying to extract certainty from what is naturally unstable, while neglecting the only territory where your authority could actually grow. This is why mornings are the ideal place to apply this lesson, because the first hour often reveals where your energy is leaking. You wake up and the mind lunges toward what is unresolved, toward who has not replied, toward what may happen, toward whether today will validate you, toward whether others will behave as you wish. At that exact moment, the Stoic interruption must occur. Return to what is yours. Your response is yours. Your standard is yours. Your effort is yours. Your honesty is yours. Your discipline is yours. Your peace of mind, to the extent that it depends on your judgments, is yours. Begin there. Stay there. Build there. This does not make you indifferent in a dead way. It makes you strong in a clean way. You can still love without trying to possess outcomes. You can still work with ambition without making your soul dependent on praise. You can still hope without collapsing when life delays the answer. This is what inner freedom looks like. Not the absence of desire, but the refusal to become a slave to what desire cannot command. A person who learns this no longer wakes up as a hostage to uncertainty. They wake up as a steward of what has actually been placed in their care. And once that distinction becomes real, another transformation becomes possible. You stop waiting for visible victories to respect yourself. You begin understanding that the first and most important victory of the day may be one that no one else will ever see. Most people think self-respect grows from public proof. They think they will finally feel solid when others notice their progress, admire their discipline, acknowledge their value, or witness their transformation. But this creates a dangerous dependence because it ties dignity to visibility. It makes the soul wait for applause before believing in its own strength. And when that applause does not come, or comes too late, or goes to someone else, the person begins to weaken again. The Stoic path moves in the opposite direction. It teaches that the first victory worth respecting is usually invisible. It happens in silence, in private, in moments so small that the world would never call them impressive, yet powerful enough to change the entire architecture of a life. This is difficult for many people to accept because the modern mind has been trained to worship what can be seen. Results, reactions, numbers, praise, recognition, status, appearance. We are surrounded by a culture that constantly invites us to perform ourselves, to display progress before it is rooted, to announce change before it has become character, to seek evidence outside before building authority inside. But a life built this way becomes fragile. The person begins to crave witnesses. They become less concerned with whether they are actually becoming stronger and more concerned with whether their strength is being observed. That is not deep self-respect. That is a quieter form of dependence. The Stoics understood that the invisible realm is where character is truly forged, not in speeches, but in choices, not in image, but in private conduct, not in how convincing you seem, but in what you repeatedly obey when no one is watching. This is why the first private victory of the morning matters so much. It may look insignificant from the outside. You do not check what weakens you. You do not return to the thought that usually controls you. You rise when comfort asks you to remain still. You keep your mind from begging for signs, reactions, permission. You hold your posture. You return to your work. No one claps, no one knows. But inside, something irreversible begins to happen. You have given yourself evidence, and evidence matters. The soul does not trust words for long. You can tell yourself that you are disciplined, clear, resilient, worthy, but if your actions do not support the claim, those words will eventually ring hollow. This is why so many people speak positively, yet still feel weak. They are trying to create self-respect through language alone, while their behavior keeps sending the opposite message. But when you achieve one invisible victory, however small, the relationship with yourself begins to change. You no longer have only intention, you have proof, not public proof, personal proof, the cleanest kind. This kind of victory is powerful because it interrupts the old pattern at its source. Most destructive habits survive because they are rehearsed privately long before they appear outwardly. So if you can win in private, you begin dismantling the machinery that used to govern you. You prove that impulse is not fate. You prove that mood is not command. You prove that the version of you that always used to give in does not have absolute control anymore. This is how identity begins to shift. Not through dramatic declarations, but through silent contradictions of your former weakness. The old self says this is where we usually fall. The new self answers by standing anyway. Marcus Aurelius wrote for himself, not for an audience. That fact alone contains an entire philosophy of inner victory. He was not trying to look wise. He was trying to remain governed. That is the standard. Can you do what is right before anyone sees it, praises it, benefits from it, or validates it? Can you remain loyal to principle in the unseen place where your real life is actually decided? The person who learns to do this becomes harder to manipulate, harder to discourage, harder to corrupt, because their source of strength is no longer dependent on external recognition. It is being built in a chamber the crowd cannot enter. This is also why invisible victories feel so quiet at first. They do not always produce excitement. Sometimes they feel almost disappointing because the ego expected drama. It wanted a breakthrough, a surge, a visible reward. Instead, all that happened was a small act of inner order. But over time, that small act becomes something immense. It becomes reliability. It becomes self-trust. It becomes the feeling that you are no longer constantly leaking strength through hidden concessions. The outside world may still see an ordinary morning, but you know that something extraordinary occurred. You did not abandon yourself where you used to. That is a victory worthy of respect, and once you begin collecting these victories, a new kind of pride emerges. Not arrogance, not superiority. A quieter kind of pride that comes from no longer being a stranger to your own strength. You start walking differently because your mind has seen you obey what is right in private. You start speaking differently because your inner voice no longer sounds like someone making promises without authority. You start carrying less desperation because you are not waiting for others to tell you that you are becoming someone solid. You already know because you have witnessed yourself in the unseen arena. This is how deep self-respect is built, secretly at first. repeatedly, without performance, without display, without begging for the world to notice. The person who can win one private battle every morning is already changing the entire direction of their life. Because the most dangerous weakness is not being imperfect in public, it is being ungoverned in private, and the cure begins the moment you stop needing visible proof to honor your own growth. But there is still another layer. Because even after a person starts winning quietly, there remains a hidden force that can either strengthen or sabotage everything. It is the way they speak to themselves when no one else can hear. The way you speak to yourself in the morning is not a small detail. It is one of the deepest forces shaping your character, your stability, and your self-respect. Long before the world says anything to you, you are already saying something to yourself. You are interpreting your life. You are assigning meaning to your past, your effort, your pain, your future, your value. And if that inner voice is careless, weak, indulgent, bitter, humiliating, or constantly dramatic, then it will quietly poison everything it touches. A person may appear composed on the outside and still be living under the rule of an inner language that slowly destroys them from within. This is why the Stoic mind is not merely disciplined in action. It is disciplined in speech, especially private speech, because words do not only describe reality, they organize it. The phrases you repeat internally become a kind of mental architecture. They determine whether the mind stands upright or collapses into self-pity, fear, confusion, resentment, or need. Most people never examine this deeply enough. They assume that because the conversation is internal, it has no serious consequence. But that is precisely where consequence begins. A person who keeps speaking to themselves like a victim will eventually start interpreting every challenge as personal oppression. A person who keeps speaking to themselves like someone fragile will begin treating discomfort as danger. A person who constantly narrates life through injury, injustice, and emotional desperation will slowly lose the ability to stand in reality with calm strength. This does not mean you should lie to yourself. Stoicism is not positive thinking in noble clothing. It does not ask you to decorate suffering with fake optimism or deny difficulty in the name of mental control. It asks for something harder and more honest. It asks that your inner speech become truthful without becoming degrading, severe without becoming theatrical, clear without becoming cruel. The goal is not to flatter yourself. The goal is to witness yourself accurately. That is a far more powerful habit, because when your inner voice becomes the voice of a witness rather than the voice of a victim, your relationship with life begins to change. A victim-centered mind always speaks from helplessness. It asks, why is this happening to me? Why am I always the one who suffers? Why does nothing go my way? Why do others have what I do not? Why am I still trapped in this feeling? Notice how powerless that language is. It may feel emotionally satisfying for a moment because it dramatizes pain and centers the self inside it. But it also teaches the mind a dangerous pattern. It teaches you to identify more with being acted upon than with choosing your response. It teaches you to keep revisiting injury instead of building command. Over time, this weakens self-respect because the soul begins to see itself less as an agent and more as a container of wounds. The witness speaks differently. The witness does not deny pain, but neither does it kneel before it. It says, "This is what I feel," but feeling is not leadership. This is what happened, but what happened does not dictate my character. This is difficult, but difficulty is not an argument against dignity. The witness observes without exaggerating. It names without collapsing. It refuses the temptation to turn every inner experience into a dramatic identity. That is one of the purest forms of self-respect. To look at your own mind and say the truth without humiliating yourself inside the process. Marcus Aurelius constantly corrected his own perception. He did not indulge endless internal storytelling. He stripped things down. He returned to essence. He reminded himself what a thing was, what it was not, and what response was worthy of a rational being. That is exactly the kind of voice you need in the morning. Not a soft voice that excuses your weakness before the day begins. Not a violent voice that attacks you in the name of discipline. Both are dangerous. One keeps you small, the other keeps you divided. What you need is a governing voice. One that can look directly at your confusion, your resistance, your discouragement, and still answer with order. Get up, return, think clearly. Do not add fantasy to difficulty. Do not insult yourself with indulgence. Do not weaken your own mind with unnecessary drama. There is a hidden dignity in learning to speak to yourself this way. You stop becoming a source of chaos to your own soul. You stop waking up and immediately drowning your mind in vague emotional language that makes everything feel heavier than it is. You stop turning discomfort into a prophecy. You stop calling yourself broken every time you struggle. You stop describing your life in ways that make action feel impossible. Instead, your inner speech starts doing what it was meant to do. It starts orienting you. It starts bringing shape to what is blurred. It starts reducing noise and restoring proportion. And this matters more than most people realize, because every outer act is preceded by some kind of inner sentence. Before you withdraw, you tell yourself something. Before you delay, you tell yourself something. Before you return to what weakens you, you tell yourself something. Before you stand firm, you also tell yourself something. The question is whether your internal language is preparing you to act with dignity or giving you a script that justifies surrender. Once you see that clearly, the morning becomes an opportunity to reclaim your voice before your old patterns speak first. The person with deep self-respect does not necessarily have easier thoughts. They have better governance over them. They know that the first conversation of the day sets the emotional and moral direction for everything that follows. So they learn to become reliable in that conversation. Steady, honest, clean. They do not allow themselves to become mentally sloppy in private and then wonder why their public life feels unstable. They understand that a disordered inner voice creates a disordered life. And once the voice becomes governed, another difficult truth rises to the surface. You begin realizing that much of your suffering has been prolonged not by confusion, but by the habit of reopening decisions you already knew were right. That is where the next lesson begins. One of the clearest signs that a person is losing self-respect is that they keep reopening decisions their conscience has already made. They know what is right, but they return to the debate. They know what weakens them, but they keep reconsidering it. They know which door should stay closed, yet each morning they stand before it again as if wisdom had never spoken. This creates a special kind of suffering, not the suffering of ignorance, but the suffering of self-division. Because the problem is no longer that you do not know. The problem is that you keep negotiating with what you already know. This is far more destructive than most people realize. A person can survive uncertainty with dignity. They can endure not knowing and still remain steady. But once the truth becomes visible and they continue betraying it through repeated inner bargaining, something begins to corrode. Their mind loses sharpness. Their will loses force. Their standards start feeling optional. The soul becomes tired, not because life is unclear, but because it is carrying the burden of constant reconsideration. It is exhausting to keep putting yourself on trial for matters your character already settled. This happens every day in small forms. You already know you should not seek your worth in someone's attention, but the mind returns to ask whether one more look, one more check, one more hope might finally bring peace. You already know you should not delay what strengthens you, but you reopen the case because comfort presents a softer argument. You already know the relationship, the habit, the fantasy, the pattern, the indulgence, the excuse that has been draining your dignity. And still the morning begins with another secret hearing. Maybe this time it will be different. Maybe one more compromise is harmless. Maybe clarity can wait. Maybe discipline can begin later. This is not reflection, it is erosion. The Stoic mind does not become strong by endlessly revisiting settled truths. It becomes strong by honoring them. Epictetus would have seen this clearly. Once reason has judged, your task is to align action with that judgment. Otherwise, your philosophy is only decoration. Marcus Aurelius did not write to himself in order to admire wisdom from a distance. He wrote to remember and obey it. That is where self-respect is formed. Not in understanding alone, but in the refusal to keep making your better judgment compete with your lower impulses as if both deserved equal authority. There is a quiet humiliation in knowing the right path and repeatedly acting as though the verdict is still undecided. You feel it when you wake up and realize you are again entertaining the same weakness that has already cost you peace. You feel it when you keep feeding the habit you promised yourself you had outgrown. You feel it when the mind tries to call confusion what is really reluctance. This is where many people suffer more than necessary. They say they are still trying to find clarity, when in truth they are trying to avoid the discipline that clarity demands. They say they are processing, but often they are just prolonging surrender in more sophisticated language. Deep self-respect requires closure where closure is due. It requires that certain inner debates end. Not because life is simple, but because some truths become poisonous when repeatedly ignored. If you know a thing weakens your mind, why keep negotiating with it? If you know a path dishonors your standards, why keep presenting it to yourself as an open option? If you know what your better self requires, why keep asking your lower self to vote on it every morning? That vote will always be corrupt. Appetite argues well, fear argues well, loneliness argues well, pride argues well, wounded emotion argues with great intensity. But none of them should sit above reason once reason has seen clearly. This is where a person begins to recover real authority. They stop reopening what has already been decided in truth. They stop pretending every temptation deserves another philosophical discussion. They stop calling every act of reluctance complexity. They begin to understand that one of the cleanest forms of self-respect is decisiveness in service of what is right, not harshness. Not rigidity for its own sake, fidelity, inner fidelity, the kind that says I will no longer exhaust my soul by making it defend the obvious every day. And something powerful happens when you live this way. Mental noise decreases, energy returns. The morning becomes less crowded because you are no longer dragging yesterday's settled truths back into today's uncertainty. You already know where you stand. So you stand there. You already know what deserves refusal, so you refuse it. You already know what your dignity requires, so you stop acting surprised by the cost. This makes the mind cleaner, more direct, less theatrical. You begin to feel a different kind of strength, the strength of no longer being in endless argument with yourself. That is part of what Marcus Aurelius was fighting for in his writings. Simplicity of allegiance, a mind that does not keep defecting from what it knows, a character that stops wasting energy on repeated internal rebellions against duty. The modern mind suffers greatly because it is overloaded with options, opinions, and distractions. But beneath all of that, there is often a simpler problem. It has not learned to honor its own better judgment with consistency. It keeps turning known truths into recurring debates, and every recurring debate delays freedom. Once you stop reopening what is already known, a new danger becomes easier to see. You notice how much of human behavior is driven by manipulation through praise, rejection, silence, attention, and emotional pressure. That is where the next lesson becomes essential. Because a person with deep self-respect must become harder to move by what others do. A person without deep self-respect is easy to move, not always visibly, not always dramatically, but inwardly, constantly. A delayed response changes their mood. A cold tone unsettles them. Praise lifts them too high. Rejection drags them too low. Silence becomes a wound. Attention becomes a drug. One look can energize them. One absence can break their rhythm. One small sign from another person can alter the entire climate of their mind. This is how manipulation often works in real life. Not through open domination, but through emotional leverage. Through the ability to pull your state up and down because your center is still located outside yourself. Most people do not like hearing this because it forces them to confront how dependent they have become on signals. They want to believe they are thinking clearly, yet their emotional condition is often being shaped by things they never chose to submit to. The approval of others, the responsiveness of others, the warmth of others, the consistency of others. And once the mind starts depending on those things to feel stable, it becomes vulnerable in ways that are both painful and humiliating. You begin waiting for reactions to determine your value. You begin interpreting silence as judgment. You begin treating another person's behavior as if it were a verdict on your worth. That is not connection. That is captivity disguised as sensitivity. The Stoics saw clearly that the person who cannot govern their response will be governed by the world. It does not matter how intelligent they are, how talented they are, or how much they understand philosophy in theory. If another person's praise can inflate them and another person's indifference can collapse them, then their peace is still rented land. It does not belong to them yet. And this is why self-respect is inseparable from emotional independence. Not emotional numbness, not pretending you never care. Independence, the ability to feel without becoming programmable, the ability to receive attention without worshipping it, and to survive its absence without turning it into a personal catastrophe. Rejection is one of the greatest tests of this. Not only rejection in love, but rejection in all its forms. Being overlooked, being dismissed, being underestimated, being ignored after giving your best. These experiences expose how much of your identity has been tied to being received well. If your whole inner structure depends on being chosen, then not being chosen will feel like annihilation. But the Stoic mind does not collapse there. It pauses and asks a harder question. Did this event change my character? Did it take my discipline? Did it corrupt my judgment? Did it make me less honest, less noble, less capable of governing myself? If not, then pain may still be present, but dignity remains intact. Praise is also dangerous, often more dangerous than rejection, because it disguises dependence as pleasure. Many people think they are strong because they respond well to approval, but approval can become a chain just as easily as rejection can. The moment you need praise to keep moving, you are no longer walking freely. The moment admiration becomes the fuel of your discipline is already compromised. You begin adjusting your behavior not around what is right, but around what is rewarded. You start craving applause in subtle ways. You speak to be noticed. You act to be affirmed. You present yourself to maintain an image. Then slowly, almost invisibly, your life stops belonging to principle and starts belonging to performance. This is why silence has such power over the weak mind. Silence removes the feedback it was depending on. No answer, no validation, no reassurance, no sign, and suddenly everything inside begins to shake. The mind rushes to fill the space with interpretations. Maybe they do not care. Maybe I am not enough. Maybe I lost something. Maybe I should change. Maybe I should chase. Maybe I should explain, but none of these reactions come from strength. They come from a self that has not yet learned how to remain whole without being continually reflected back by others. Deep self-respect changes this. It does not make you incapable of feeling hurt, but it makes you far harder to manipulate through emotional signals. You no longer rush to abandon your standards because someone withdrew warmth. You no longer become inflated because someone admires you. You no longer treat every external shift as an internal command. Instead, a kind of steadiness begins to form. You observe praise and do not kneel. You observe rejection and do not dissolve. You observe silence and do not invent 1,000 stories to explain it. You return to what is yours, your conduct, your reason, your duty, your inner order. That return is power. Marcus Aurelius had to live among opinions, politics, loyalty, betrayal, flattery, hostility, and constant judgment. He could not afford a mind that moved with every voice around him. Neither can you. Not if you want peace, not if you want depth, not if you want the kind of self-respect that makes a person difficult to destabilize. Because the world is always offering hooks. Praise is a hook, rejection is a hook, attention is a hook, silence is a hook. The question is whether there is still enough hunger in you to bite every time. A person with inner authority becomes harder to hook because they no longer need every signal to confirm who they are. And that is one of the most beautiful changes a human being can experience. To stop living as if every interaction must define you. To stop waking up and immediately wondering who will validate your existence today. To stop building your emotional state around responses you cannot command. That is freedom. Quiet freedom. Strong freedom. The kind that makes your presence calmer, your choices cleaner, and your life much harder for the world to manipulate. But there is still one final lesson, and it gathers everything that came before. Because a person does not build deep self-respect by merely surviving the morning. They build it by ending the morning with a standard that can govern the rest of the day. Most people begin the day with hope, not with a standard. They hope to feel better. They hope nothing disturbs them. They hope people respond well. They hope motivation appears. They hope the day unfolds in a way that makes discipline easier, peace more natural, effort more rewarding. But hope without a governing standard is fragile. It leaves the mind exposed to circumstances. It creates a person who can be sincere yet unstable, well-intentioned yet easily diverted, full of desire yet lacking command. And when the day fails to cooperate, as life often does, that person begins to scatter. Their mood changes. Their focus breaks. Their principles start negotiating with pressure. Then they call it a difficult day, when often it was simply a day they entered without an inner code strong enough to endure reality. The Stoic does not wake up and merely wish for a good day. He enters the day under a rule. This is one of the deepest sources of self-respect. Not positive expectation, but chosen direction. Marcus Aurelius constantly brought himself back to this. He reminded himself what kind of person he intended to be before the world gave him reasons to forget. That is the discipline modern minds are missing. Many people want peace, but they have no governing principle for protecting it. They want clarity, but they have no rule for returning to it. They want dignity, but they have no standard that decides how they will think, speak, and act when discomfort, temptation, disrespect, confusion, or delay appear. Without that, they do not really live by character. They live by reaction decorated with good intentions. A standard changes everything because it turns the morning into an act of alignment instead of a vague emotional beginning. It gives the mind a center to return to. A person with a standard does not have to invent themselves from scratch each time the world becomes difficult. They already know the line they do not cross. They already know the tone they will not use with themselves. They already know what they will refuse, what they will endure, what they will remain faithful to. This gives the soul structure. It removes a great deal of unnecessary confusion because many of the day's decisions have already been made in advance through principle. When pressure arrives, the question is no longer, what do I feel like doing now? The question becomes, what is consistent with the standard I have chosen to live by? That is where hope proves too weak on its own. Hope says, maybe today I will remain calm. A standard says, I will not let irritation rule my tongue. Hope says, maybe today I will feel disciplined. A standard says, I rise to do what is mine to do, whether enthusiasm joins me or not. Hope says, maybe today I will not overreact. A standard says, I do not surrender judgment to impulse. One depends on favorable internal weather. The other creates a form of inner architecture that can stand through storms. This is why a person with standards often appears calmer than others. It is not because life spares them. It is because they are not improvising their values in the middle of battle. There is also a hidden mercy in standards. They reduce self-contempt. Much of the disappointment people feel toward themselves comes from living without fixed inner lines. They wander, they react, they compromise. They get pulled into moods, distractions, cravings, external pressures, and then later feel the pain of having lived beneath what they actually knew was right. But when you begin the morning with a standard, you give yourself a chance to meet the day with coherence. Even if you struggle, even if you feel resistance, even if the day hurts you, there is still a path back. Your code remains, your governing principle remains. You are not lost every time life becomes messy, because your direction was never supposed to come from the mood of the moment. This is where deep self-respect matures. It stops being only about avoiding weakness and becomes a way of inhabiting life. You no longer just fight what diminishes you. You stand for something. You know the quality of mind you are trying to preserve. You know the conduct that keeps you whole. You know the kind of person you refuse to stop being just because the world becomes inconvenient, unfair, silent, seductive, or painful. That is what makes self-respect deep. It is not temporary confidence. It is not emotional elevation. It is not a passing sense of worth. It is allegiance. Allegiance to a way of being that you choose again each morning before life tests whether you mean it. Seneca understood that a disordered mind suffers from being dragged in too many directions at once. Standards end that drag. They gather the self. They simplify the moral landscape. They make life less theatrical and more serious in the best way. Not grim, not rigid. Serious enough to remember that your peace is too valuable to leave unguarded. Your character too important to leave unformed. Your mornings too decisive to leave to accident. A person who lives this way does not need to win every moment. They do not need to feel perfect. They simply need to return, again and again, to the rule they have chosen as worthy of a rational and disciplined life. And that is the final shift Marcus Aurelius points us toward. Do not wake up asking the world to be kinder before you can be steady. Do not ask life to become softer before you can become strong. Do not ask emotion to cooperate before you can act with dignity. Wake up and remember your standard. Remember what belongs to you. Remember the kind of mind you are trying to build. Remember that self-respect is not granted by approval, protected by comfort, or completed by admiration. It is built in private, through alignment, through clear thought, through disciplined action, through the refusal to betray yourself in small moments no one else will ever see. Every morning gives you that choice again, to live as reaction or as authority, to begin in hunger or in order, to hand your value to the world or to root it in conduct, to seek comfort first or function first, to be moved by every signal, or to stand under a principle that does not collapse when life becomes uncertain. This is what it means to rewire the mind, not through empty affirmation, but through repeated return to what is timeless. The Stoic does not become unbreakable because life stops striking him. He becomes unbreakable because each morning he remembers where his real strength must come from. If you have listened this far, then you already know the truth most people spend years trying to avoid. Self-respect is not lost in public first. It is lost in private, in the repeated moments when a person abandons their own reason, bends their standards, obeys their lowest impulses and hands their peace to things that were never meant to govern them. And if that is where it is lost, then that is also where it must be rebuilt. Not through appearance, not through performance, not through admiration from others, through the quiet restoration of inner authority. That is what Marcus Aurelius understood. Before he could face an empire, he had to face his own mind. Before he could endure betrayal, pressure, exhaustion, disappointment, and the madness of the world around him, he had to return to one central truth. A man is not destroyed first by what happens outside him. He is destroyed when he stops governing what happens within. That is why these lessons matter. They are not ornaments for the intellect. They are tools for survival, for dignity, for a life that does not collapse every time the world withholds comfort. Every morning, you are being asked a question, whether you notice it or not. Who will lead today? Your reason or your reactions, your standard or your cravings, your discipline or your mood, your conscience or your fear. The answer is not given once and for all. It is given daily, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully, sometimes in moments so small they seem insignificant. But those moments are where your character is being shaped. They are where your future is being rehearsed. They are where your soul learns whether your values are real or whether they disappear the moment life becomes inconvenient. The world will continue doing what it does. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will ignore you. Some will praise you too much. Others will not value you at all. There will be days of doubt, days of fatigue, days when your mind feels heavier than your body, days when old habits try to reclaim their power over you. Stoicism never promised the removal of these things. It promised something greater. It promised that you do not have to belong to them, that you can still think clearly in the middle of confusion, that you can still act with dignity in the middle of temptation, that you can still remain your own in a world constantly trying to pull you away from yourself. This is what deep self-respect really is. It is not pride in your image. It is loyalty to your highest judgment. It is not arrogance. It is self-command. It is not cold detachment from life. It is disciplined alignment with what is true, necessary, and worthy. It is the ability to wake up each day and say, I will not betray myself to be comforted. I will not abandon my standards to be accepted. I will not surrender my peace to what I cannot control. I will not live this day as if my worth depends on being chosen by the world. I will live it by being faithful to what is right within me. And that is where real freedom begins. Not when everything feels easy, but when you stop needing ease to remain noble. Not when everyone sees your value, but when you no longer need their sight to know where your dignity stands. Not when life stops testing you, but when the tests stop deciding who you are. A person who reaches that point may still feel pain, but they are no longer ruled by it. They may still be wounded, but they are not broken by every wound. They may still be human, but they are no longer scattered. They become centered, governed, whole. So when tomorrow morning comes, do not wait for the perfect feeling. Do not wait for permission from mood, from memory, from attention, from comfort, from the world. Rise and return to your standard. Return to your reason. Return to your duty. Return to the self you are trying to build in silence. Because the mind is rewired exactly there, not in one dramatic breakthrough, but in the repeated decision to begin the day under your own command.